She wasn't asking for love. She was asking to not be sold like cattle. Imagine being 20 years old, barefoot on cracked earth, lined up like livestock in a dusty frontier town. No name, no rights, just a price tag hanging silently in the air. In that moment, a girl named Clara whispered to a stranger not with hope, but with desperation, "Take me. I can cook. I can bear you children too." Now, pause. What would you do if you were him? A widowed cowboy, quiet and tired of the world, staring into the eyes of a woman who had nothing left except the courage to ask. This is a story of two people who didn't rescue each other, but instead made space to heal, to choose something deeper than survival. In a time when justice rode slow and love rode even slower, could tenderness still bloom? Stay with us through this journey of silence, scars, and soft redemption. If the story moves you, leave a comment, subscribe, or share with someone who still believes in second chances. Now, let us take you back to Dry Hollow, where everything changed with a whisper. Hold on to that whisper, a frail voice across the dusty night asking for hope. Dry Hollow didn't offer much to hope for. Not under that cracked July sky. Not among the crooked stalls and whiskey-soaked laughter of its night market. The ground was dry enough to split open beneath a boot heel, and the heat clung to the skin like an old debt. But even so, people came. To trade, to vanish, to forget, or to sell what pieces of themselves the world hadn't taken yet. Clara stood near the back of the market, half-shadowed behind a stack of burlap sacks, her bare feet caked in red dust. Her dress hung loose, too big at the shoulders, too short at the ankles, and her hair, once neatly braided, now stuck to her cheeks in damp strands. She didn't speak, not unless someone asked. And even then, her voice barely cleared the noise, but her eyes hazel and still watched everything. By the livestock pens, two men haggled over a lame mule. Farther down, a preacher shouted at nobody in particular, somewhere nearby. A banjo plucked out an off-key tune, and through it all, Clara stood, waiting. But not for a buyer. She was waiting for something quieter, something that might listen. That's when she saw him. Jedediah Boone wasn't the kind of man the market noticed. He rode in slow, alone, hat pulled low, coat coated in trail dust. His mare was lean, ribs faint under her hide, but her hooves hit the ground with certainty. She wasn't new, neither was he. Jed dismounted near the tack shop, tied the reins with one hand, and adjusted the strap across his shoulder. No one greeted him. No one expected to. And that suited him fine. He had come for nails, for a harness buckle, and maybe a tin of chewing tobacco if he could find it cheap. Not for trouble. Certainly not for company. But Dry Hollow had a way of offering what you didn't ask for. He moved past the crates and barrels, past the cook fires and open bottles, his steps slow but unhesitant. A few nodded. Most didn't. He was a face remembered vaguely, the way ghosts are once real, now just shape and silence. Clara saw him from 20 paces off. Something in his walk pulled her eyes. Not the limp feint, but the way he didn't look around. He moved through the noise like a man under water. Or under it. He passed her once, didn't notice. The second time, she stepped forward, only a little, just enough. He didn't turn, not yet. But he slowed. She spoke. Not loud, not desperate, not like the others who begged. "Please, take me," she said, her voice trembling with dust and hope. "I can cook. I can bear you children." Jed stopped. The market didn't. Behind them, a woman laughed too loud. A bottle shattered. Somewhere, a baby cried. But in the space between his stillness and her breath, there was quiet. He turned slowly. His eyes were dark, deep-set, half hidden under the brim of his hat. She didn't look away. She wasn't the prettiest. Her cheek was bruised, a fading yellow under one eye. She looked tired, older than she was, but there was something in her face, stillness. Maybe. Resolve. Jed said nothing. Not then, just looked. Not at her figure, not at the bare feet or the two small shoes tossed near the fire pit. He looked at her eyes and saw she meant it. Clara wasn't asking to be rescued. She was asking to be seen. He stepped closer, took a crumpled bill from his coat pocket, and handed it to the man sitting behind the crate, the one keeping tally. The one who pretended not to hear. 12, Jed said, flat, final. The man blinked. 12. For her, Jed didn't repeat himself. Clara held her breath. She waited for him to ask something, her name, her age, if she was clean. But Jed asked nothing. He just turned and walked. For one terrifying second, she thought he might leave her standing there, that maybe she'd imagined it all. But then his voice reached her, not turned back, not loud, but there. Come on. She didn't hesitate. She stepped from the shadow of the sacks, feet light, quick. She didn't grab his arm, didn't look back, just followed the man whose eyes had stopped when they met hers. The lanterns flickered as they passed, casting their shadows long and wavering across the dry ground, and in that moment, nothing changed, except everything. That night, no words passed between them, but the trail was long, and silence would only carry so far. Soon, the dust would settle, and so would something else. No one spoke a word on the ride back, silence more telling than any promise. The sky over Dry Hollow had turned the color of smudged ash. What little breeze there was carried only the smell of dry sage and tired animals. The moon hung low, pale and tired like everything else in that part of the world. Jed walked ahead, reins in hand. Clara followed. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders ached. But she didn't fall behind. They didn't speak. There was no need. Each hoofbeat against the packed earth marked the slow passing of something unnamed. The crunch of dry grass beneath worn boots filled what little space the wind had left untouched. Even the mare, patient and lean, seemed to sense that words weren't welcome. Clara had been carried before, thrown into wagons, pulled behind carts, tossed like cargo. But this was different. Jed hadn't touched her, hadn't offered help, hadn't looked back. Yet somehow, she didn't feel discarded. She felt human. For the first time in a long while. The trail twisted beyond the edge of the market into the hills where the stars grew thicker and closer. No torches, no fences, just dark silhouettes of mesquite and the steady rhythm of footsteps. She could barely make out the outline of a house until they were almost on top of it. Jed stopped first. The mare shook her mane and exhaled. He untied a worn rope from the gate, let them in, and nodded for her to follow. The homestead wasn't much. A squat, single-room cabin with a low porch and a tin chimney barely clinging to the roof. A fence leaned hard to one side. In the distance, a goat bleated once, then fell silent again. Inside, the walls smelled of wood smoke and sweat. A fire still glowed in the stove's belly. A loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, rested on the table beside two tin bowls. Jed shrugged off his coat, hung it by the door. Still no words. Clara stood near the threshold, unsure. Her hands hovered over the frayed hem of her dress. Then, quietly, she stepped forward, pulled the bowl toward her, and sat on the floor beside the fire. Not because she was told, but because it felt like the only place in the world where the heat was real. She didn't eat fast. She didn't speak. She lifted the spoon like it might vanish if she moved too quick. Jed didn't stop her. He sat in the chair, boots crossed, arms folded. His face held no judgment, just that same distant quiet, like he was waiting for a thunderstorm that never came. Minutes passed. The fire cracked once, sharp and sudden. Clara flinched, then stilled again. When she finished, she placed the spoon back into the bowl, carefully, as if afraid the sound would wake something sleeping. Jed stood, picked up a thick blanket from the rocker by the hearth, and laid it on the edge of the bed. "You take that," he said, voice flat, eyes on the fire. "I'll be in the barn." Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat felt too tight. She watched him walk to the door. He paused once just for a heartbeat before stepping out into the dark. The door closed behind him with a soft creak. And then there was silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but full. Clara lay down on the bed, not bothering to remove the dust from her feet. Her body curled in on itself like it remembered how to be small. She didn't cry. She listened to the fire popping, to the wind brushing the outside wall, to her own breath moving in and out like waves against dry shore. And then, just before sleep took her, she heard it. Not a voice, not a step, just a faint shift in the rafters, and the soft fall of dust onto the floor beside the bed. She opened her eyes. The night held still, but something had changed. In the still morning air, Clara would rise not with fear, but with purpose. And for the first time in years, her hands would reach for a broom instead of a door handle. Daylight reveals more than chores. A fragile empathy begins to bloom. The first full morning in Jedediah Boone's cabin arrived without fanfare. No rooster crowed, no bell tolled. Just the slow spreading of sunlight through a dusty window pane and the gentle crackle of firewood that someone else had set before dawn. Clara blinked into the warmth. Her body ached less than it had the night before, but something inside her remained tense, like an old wire stretched too long, waiting to snap. She sat up slowly, pulling the coarse wool blanket over her knees. A cup of water sat on the table beside the bread from last night. She hadn't heard him come in or go out. Still, he'd left it there. She didn't drink right away. Instead, she stood, crossed the small room barefoot, her toes curling on the uneven wooden floor. The air inside the cabin held a weight, not of danger, but of restraint. Nothing in the room was decorative. Nothing asked for attention. It was a space built to survive, not to welcome. And yet, she didn't feel unwelcome. She opened the door. Outside, the early light cut through thin morning fog. Jed stood 20 feet from the cabin, sleeves rolled, splitting wood in steady, practiced rhythm. He didn't look over, didn't wave, just worked. Clara closed the door again. Inside. She set to her own rhythm, not because he asked, but because her hands needed purpose. Something to press into, something that didn't ask questions. She swept the corners of the floor, lifted the worn rug, and shook it outside. She found a rusted tin basin under the bed and used it to scrub the table. Then, without really knowing why, she opened the cupboard and began sorting the dried goods by type. Size, smell, flour, salt, dried beans, 3 old apples beginning to wrinkle. At midday, Jed returned. He carried 2 rabbits, already cleaned. He hung them without comment and placed a new sack of oats on the shelf near the stove. Their eyes met briefly. She nodded once. He didn't nod back, but he didn't turn away either. Later that afternoon, Clara cooked. She found a cracked iron pot, boiled the beans, added water, lard, and a handful of salt. As it simmered, she sliced what she could from one of the apples, added it in. The smell filled the room slowly, like warmth returning to old walls. Jed didn't say it smelled good, but he showed up at the table before she called. They didn't sit across from each other. She took the floor again, back against the wall. He remained in his chair, boots still dusty. His spoon moved slow, deliberate. He finished before she did, left the empty bowl on the table, walked out into the evening. She heard the barn door close behind him, and still she didn't feel dismissed. That night, Clara lit a second lantern. Its glow was softer, gentler. She left it near the bed, then pulled out the old basket of mending she'd seen in the corner earlier. The shirts inside were stiff, stained, and full of old seams coming undone. She chose the one with a missing cuff, threaded a needle, and began to sew. When Jed returned, he said nothing, but he paused in the doorway a little longer, watched her hands for a moment, then crossed the room, removed his coat, and sat without a word. The fire warmed the space between them. Outside, the sky turned deep gray. Shadows slipped across the floor in slow, careful lines, and still neither of them spoke. It was the silence that told the story, a silence not filled with fear, but with breath, with shared presence, with something neither of them dared name. The next morning, Clara woke early. She found a basket of fresh carrots on the table, still damp with dew. No note, no sound, just a quiet offering. She stared at it for a long moment, then washed each one, dried them with a scrap of cloth, and set them in a neat row by the stove. By dusk, the pot on the fire held stew richer than any she'd made in months. She added salt with care, stirred slow, sat near the fire with a piece of cloth in her lap. The needle moved, steady and gentle. Jed sat across the room, sharpening a knife, not watching her, but not avoiding her either. When the knife was done, he set it aside, and in that stillness, their eyes met, just for a moment, and in that moment, something opened, a glance, a flicker of recognition, not of who they were, but of what they had both endured and somehow survived. As the light faded, Clara stood at the window and watched the long shadows stretch across the dirt. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she could feel it shifting. Something or someone was coming. A ghost from Jed's past rides back into their fragile peace. The sun hadn't yet reached its peak when the dog barked. Jed looked up from the trough, water sloshing from the bucket in his hand. The air had been still all morning. No wind, no warning. Only the faint crunch of hooves on dry earth, slow, steady, deliberate. He stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. Clara stood just inside the cabin, bowl in hand, halfway between stove and table. Her face drained of color before the rider even came into view. He came alone, tall in the saddle, coat unbuttoned, grin oily and wide beneath a bristle of beard. The same man who'd traded Clara not 2 weeks before. The same eyes that had looked through her like she was nothing more than cattle. His voice carried before he reached the gate. Well, I'll be damned. Jedediah Boone still breathing. Jed didn't answer. The man dismounted with a lazy swagger, letting the dust settle around his boots. He glanced toward the house, spotted Clara, smirked. You always did have a taste for what didn't belong to you, he said, squinting. Jed stepped off the porch. Slow, grounded. She's not yours, he said quietly. The man laughed. No, thought she came with paper. Thought you paid good money for her. He pulled something from his coat pocket, folded parchment, creased, yellowed. Held it between 2 fingers like an accusation. Jed didn't flinch. She walked out on her own. No chains, no rope. You got nothing. The man shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But I do have this. He held the paper out, shaking it like a flag. Now, I don't care if you keep her. Hell, I don't even care if you marry her. Just pay what you owe. $20 more. That's all I'm asking. Inside the doorway. Clara stepped forward. Her hands didn't shake. She took the paper, held it up. The man's smile widened until she tore it in half. Then in quarters. Then again, the pieces fluttered to the porch floor like falling ash. I am not property, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble, but it stopped the wind. The man's eyes narrowed. Now listen here. Girl Jed stepped between them, his body still, but the fire in his eyes older than the dust in his boots. You had your say. Now ride out. You threatening me? The man asked, spitting at the dirt. Jed didn't answer. Didn't need to. His silence was sharper than steel. The man looked from Jed to Clara, then back again. His fingers twitched near the saddle strap, but he didn't reach. Fine, he muttered, but this ain't over. He turned, mounted, rode off slow, kicking up a wake of silence behind him. Clara didn't move until he was a speck on the horizon. Even then, she didn't speak. She bent down, gathered the torn pieces of paper, and tossed them into the stove. Flames caught the edges, curled them black. Jed watched her from the doorway. That night, they didn't eat much. The bread sat untouched. The fire burned low. Outside, coyotes howled at the edge of the hills, but inside, the cabin was quieter still. Jed sat by the door, rifle across his lap. Clara sat by the fire, legs drawn to her chest. She didn't cry, but she didn't sleep either, not with the echo of boots still fresh on the earth outside. And somewhere out past the edge of firelight, something darker waited. The man might have left, but the past hadn't. And before the sun rose again, Clara would learn what it meant to stand her ground, not just with words, but with will. Midnight had a way of peeling the calm off a man. It came not with lightning or rain, but with stillness, heavy, intentional, the kind that made you feel like even the wind had something to hide. Jed Boone stood by the window of the cabin, rifle in hand. Outside, the night was ink black, no moon, no stars, just the slow, creeping hush of something coming. Behind him, Clara hadn't slept. She lay on the narrow bed, eyes wide open, her hands wrapped around a wool blanket, but her fingers twitching beneath. She could feel it too, that hum beneath the silence, the wrongness of the air. Jed didn't look back. He didn't have to. They're here, Clara whispered. It wasn't a question. Jed nodded once, still facing the dark. He stepped away from the window. Careful, controlled. He opened a drawer and pulled out the revolver, the same one he'd handed her days ago, but hoped she'd never have to use. This time, she took it without flinching. They won't knock, she said, her voice quiet. They will, he replied. Men like that enjoy the formality, makes them feel civil before they do what they came to do. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals. Jed didn't stoke it. No need to give them more light than they already had. He dimmed the lantern low and motioned for Clara to stay near the hearth, behind the cast-iron stove. Then the knock came. 3 taps, measured, not urgent, just confident. Jed stayed silent. A second knock, harder, then a voice. Well now, came the slow drawl. I was hoping we could talk. Boone. Jed recognized it. Same man from the market. Slick tongue, colder smile. You know what I want. The voice continued. Ain't nothing personal. Still. Jed said nothing. Another voice, younger, twitchier, cut in. We saw your light. Don't make us come in. Jed finally answered. Calm. Cold. You come through this door. You'll regret it. The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through. Then, bang. A boot kicked the door. It held, but just barely. Clara startled, but held her ground. Jed's eyes narrowed. Outside. Horses snorted. One rider paced. Then came the scrape of a boot on wood. Someone stepping onto the porch. Clara edged toward the window. Her heart thundered. She knew she shouldn't, but she needed to see. Through the slit in the curtain, she saw two shadows, one standing, hand on his hip, the other crouched low, near the barn. They weren't just here to scare. Clara backed away, pressed herself into the corner beside the stove. Jed raised his rifle and stepped to the side of the door. Another kick. The door shuddered, wood creaking, then silence. Clara's breath was shallow now. Her fingers tightened on the revolver. She looked at Jed. He gave her one small nod, and in that moment, she made her choice. She stepped out from the shadows and raised the gun, not at the door, at the beam above it, and fired. The crack tore through the cabin, echoed into the night. A chunk of wood splintered and fell. Outside, the man stumbled back, cursing. The younger one let out a yelp. Horses reared, chaos in the dark. Jed stepped into the center of the room, rifle aimed, but no more shots came. Outside, bootsteps scrambled. Then a voice angrier now. "You made your point. Boone, but this ain't over." Jed didn't respond. The shadows retreated. Hooves clattered down the trail. Then silence. Real silence. Not waiting, not charged. Just still. Inside. Clara lowered the gun. Her hands trembled. She stared at the broken beam above the door, smoke still curling from the shot. Jed stepped forward and took the revolver gently from her hand. "You did good," he said, his voice soft. Clara didn't answer. Not yet. She crossed the room, sat at the edge of the bed, and buried her face in her hands. Jed turned back toward the window, scanning the dark, listening. Only wind. He moved slowly, quietly, stoking the fire now. The room warmed again, but neither of them moved toward the light. Minutes passed, maybe more. Finally, Clara spoke. "I wasn't aiming to miss." Jed turned. She looked up. Her eyes were clear, but I needed them to know I wasn't afraid anymore. Jed nodded. That's more than most would have done. They didn't speak again. He brought the revolver back to the table, laid it gently beside the rifle. Then he sat down across from her. They shared no meal, no words. But something in the air had shifted. Not safety. Not yet. But something close. And when dawn finally broke, soft and reluctant, Clara would find more than rest. She would find the truth hidden in Jed's quiet hands, and the pain he had buried just as deep. No cheers, no cries, just a hand placed on a shoulder. The cabin had returned to stillness, but not the same kind as before. This one was earned, hard-won. It carried the aftertaste of fear, of courage, of a line that had been drawn and crossed, then redrawn, by hands that refused to tremble any longer. Outside, the prairie wind stirred the grass like whispers, but the threat had faded. The men were gone, for now, at least. Jed stood by the window, watching. The last of the dust from the riders had settled. The moon had finally climbed over the hills, bathing the fence line in a silver that felt almost too gentle for what the night had brought. Behind him, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders low but not slumped. Her eyes were fixed on the revolver, now back on the table, its barrel still faintly warm. Jed turned, slow and deliberate, and crossed the room. He filled a tin cup with water from the jug, the sound of pouring loud in the quiet. Without a word, he walked over and handed it to her. Clara looked up, not startled, but searching. Their fingers touched briefly as she took the cup. Then, as she drank, he sat down beside her, not across the room, not at the table, but beside her, close. When she finished, she placed the cup on the floor. The fire popped softly. She stared at the glowing embers, not speaking. Then came the smallest motion. Jed reached out and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He didn't grip it, didn't pat it, just placed it there, steady, warm, present. Clara didn't move. Not at first. She felt the weight of it, not heavy, but grounding, like something she'd never known she missed until it was there. It wasn't romantic, wasn't protective. It was something simpler. Trust. They stayed like that, two people not needing words. A minute passed, then another. No cheers, no cries, just his hand, her breath, the fire. Finally. Clara spoke. Her voice was low, but even. Why did you stay? Jed didn't remove his hand. Because you did. Clara blinked. She wanted to say more, wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his stillness told her it didn't need explaining. Not tonight. She closed her eyes for a moment, let herself lean, not much, but enough. Enough to let him know she wasn't just grateful. She was no longer alone. And yet, in the back of her mind, fear still fluttered. Not fear of the men, not even of the dark, but of waking up one morning and finding this quiet, this warmth, gone. Like so many other good things had gone before. She didn't say that, though. She just stayed where she was, shoulder beneath his hand, heart still pounding a little softer now. Jed stood slowly, walked to the stove, and added a log. The fire welcomed it with a crackle. He turned. "Get some sleep," he said. Then he walked to the door. Before stepping out, he paused, looked back. Clara met his eyes, and in that look, something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than the shot she had fired. But peace, like prairie spring, never stayed long. By morning, new tracks would appear, ones neither of them expected. In an old box, unopened for years, everything changed. Morning broke slowly, the sky pale and unsure. Clara stepped out to feed the chickens while Jed busied himself in the barn. Neither said much, but the silence was no longer brittle. It felt settled, familiar. Later, when Jed rode into town for supplies, Clara stayed behind. She wasn't snooping, at least she told herself that, but in a quiet cabin, the corners whisper, and something in her feet, in her fingers, drew her toward the low wooden dresser Jed rarely touched. The third drawer stuck a little. Behind the neatly folded shirts, she found it, a simple box, plain wood, smoothed by years, no lock, no inscription. She paused, just long enough to ask herself if she had the right, then opened it. Inside a folded handkerchief, unfinished, a needle still threaded through soft blue cotton, the edges embroidered in fading white, delicate initials half-formed, a spoon with a cracked handle, a dried flower, brittle but whole, and a note creased, worn at the edges, unsigned. She didn't read it right away. Her hands went first to the fabric. She ran a finger over the stitching. Gentle, feminine, a pattern of tiny vines curling inward. At the corner, the letter M, only half done. Clara held it to her chest. Then slowly, carefully, she threaded the needle again. The chair creaked as she sat down by the fire. The silence in the room deepened, wrapped around her like the wool blanket on the bed. And she began to sew. She didn't mimic the old pattern. She added something new. She finished the M. Then, just beside it, tucked into the folds of thread and time, she added a small star, subtle, her own symbol, not meant to overwrite, only to sit quietly beside. Her stitches were slow, careful. With each pass of the needle, she felt the weight of time. The cloth warmed in her hands. This wasn't just fabric, it was memory. And she wasn't just mending. She was continuing a story. When Jed returned, the sun had dropped low behind the ridge. Clara didn't greet him at the door. She was still at the table, bent over the cloth, thread slipping through her fingers like water. He stepped inside and stopped. Saw the box, the cloth in her hands. For a long moment. He didn't move. Clara didn't hide it. She looked up, held his gaze. "I found it," she said simply. "I didn't mean to, but I couldn't pretend I didn't see it." Jed's jaw tightened. He stepped forward. She held up the cloth. "I didn't finish it for her," Clara said. "I finished it because it mattered, because you kept it, because maybe some things shouldn't stay unfinished." Jed took the cloth slowly, turned it over in his hands. His eyes caught the new stitch. The star, small, delicate, but present. He ran a thumb over it, then looked at her. "I remember when she started this," he said, voice like worn gravel. "She never liked to sew. Said her fingers were too stiff." Clara smiled faintly. She wasn't wrong. The thread looped backwards twice. Jed almost chuckled. Almost. Instead, he looked down again. "I couldn't bring myself to finish it," he said. Felt like closing a door I wasn't ready to close. Clara didn't speak. The fire cracked. Outside, an owl called once, low and distant. Jed sat in the chair beside her. He didn't hand the cloth back, didn't fold it away, just held it. Two people, two names, two lives, and one piece of fabric between them. But a stitched memory, no matter how careful, cannot hold back the future. And tomorrow, something new was coming down the road. No words spoken, but a ring waits quietly on the table. The dawn came quietly that morning. No rooster crowed, no wind stirred. Even the horses seemed to step softer in their stalls. Inside the cabin, Clara moved slowly, as if something delicate was hanging in the air, and she didn't want to disturb it. The fire had burned low during the night, just embers now. She stirred it back to life, added a log, and set the kettle over the flame. Jed had already gone out. Not far, she knew his rhythms by now. Likely to the barn, checking feed, brushing the mare. But when he returned, his steps were slower than usual. Not tired, just thoughtful. He didn't speak, didn't take his coat off right away either. Instead, he walked to the old dresser and reached inside the same drawer where the wooden box had been. This time, it wasn't a cloth he held. It was something small, something wrapped in a piece of brown paper, folded neat. Clara watched without asking. He moved to the table, set it down, and left again. The kettle began to whistle. She turned the flame low, poured the hot water into 2 cups, and carried them to the table. Her fingers paused above the parcel. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she sat, let the warmth from the mug seep into her hands, then slowly unwrapped the paper. Inside lay a ring, not store-bought, not shiny. It was handcrafted. The band bore tiny tool marks along its edges, made from brass, smoothed with age. Simple, solid, honest. But what caught her breath was what she saw on the inside. A soft engraving barely visible. Not letters, just a mark, a star, the same as the one she'd stitched onto the handkerchief. Clara placed the ring on her palm, stared, let its weight settle. No one had said anything, no proposal, no vow. But it sat there like a truth that didn't need language, a promise already spoken in the way Jed had handed her a cup of water, in the way he'd left her the blanket warm every night, in the silence he respected, in the fire he always stoked before stepping out into the cold. It wasn't about marriage, not yet. It was about something older, recognition, and a desire not to possess, but to remain. She lifted the ring to eye level. The metal caught a bit of sun from the window. It glowed gently, like a firebank under ash. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. Small, private, not for anyone else, just for herself. Jed came back in carrying a pail of water. He didn't glance toward the table, didn't ask whether she had seen the ring. He just poured the water into the basin, wiped his hands, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Then he sat across from her. Their eyes met. He raised his cup. She mirrored him. They drank in silence. The ring lay between them. Nothing more was said, but everything that mattered had already been spoken, not by lips, but by quiet, by patience, by care, by staying. But promises, even the quietest ones, must one day face the winds of change. And by nightfall, another rider would arrive with a letter that neither expected. Baking cornbread can heal more than hunger. The morning air carried a softness that felt like an apology. Clara woke before sunrise, as she often did, to the quiet promise of another day. Inside, her kitchen modest, warm, dusted in flour, waited like an old friend. The cast-iron skillet sat on the stove, and she slid her hand across its handle, feeling the lingering heat from last night's embers. She paused. Her fingers brushed against a spot where the metal glimmered faintly. A reminder that warmth, once made, tends to stay. Clara mixed the batter for cornbread in a large bowl. Cornmeal, eggs, milk, a little sugar, and honey, the smell of sunshine, folded into the batter. A bead of morning light caught on the flour-dusted edge of the bowl, and she smiled softly. Every morning, she baked 2 loaves, one to sell, one she kept. Today, she would place both on the counter. Later, lemonade, fresh lemons, a handful of mint, cold water like liquid clarity in a glass. The door chime rang softly as Jed stepped in from the morning's chores. He carried a pair of tools, a rasp, and a cloth. His hands bore a faint trace of dust and oak shavings. He paused, took a breath. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, the oval of light behind her like a glow. She caught his gaze and nodded. Nothing more. The cornbread baked golden in the oven. She carried 2 steaming loaves to the counter and placed them neatly. 1 loaf for someone hungry, 1 loaf for hope, hers, his, whoever needed it. She poured lemonade into 2 glasses, pinkies lifted without thought, and set them near the window. Then the door swung open gently. A small girl appeared barefoot, dress worn, eyes wide like she'd just discovered sunlight. "Miss Clara," she said, voice soft, curious. Clara reached for the girl's small hand and guided her to a chair near the bench. Clara smiled. "What can I get for you?" The girl's eyes lingered on Jed, who was stepping forward with a steady foot. Then she turned back to Clara. "Smile shy, earnest. Do you love him because he's handsome?" Every spoonful of cornbread taste froze. Even the skillet's warmth felt distant. Clara stared at the little girl, 6 years old, faith in every innocent syllable. The kitchen hushed. Even the clock ticked slower, because that question so simple felt like thunder in her chest. She caught Jed's eye steady, clear. No words, just home. Clara knelt by the child, hands quiet. "No," she said, breath steady, voice calm, "not because he's handsome." The child blinked. She looked at Jed, then back at Clara. Then why Clara exhaled softly, tucked a stray curl behind her ear. "Because," she said, "he sees me, not fix me, not direct me, just sees me." The child frowned, thoughtful, then said quietly, "Like the way you see this kitchen, Clara weighed that for a moment, then nodded. Exactly like that, she whispered. Someone cleared their throat from behind. Jed, hands folded before him. She rose, turned to him slowly. They shared the smallest, most honest smile. No words necessary. The kitchen door opened again. Sunlight stretched into the room. Clara handed the child half a slice of warm cornbread, then offered Jed a glass of lemonade. He took it, amber liquid catching the light. He didn't speak. She didn't speak, but the warmth between them made words unnecessary. Outside, a breeze flicked the curtains. The little girl scurried away with her bread, skipping like she carried a secret. The kitchen hummed again, clink of spoon and bowl, sizzle of something simmering. But something lingered, a fragile piece. The kind that lingers when two people stop fixing each other and simply, see, the sun dipped lower, painting the kitchen in honeyed tones. Clara watched Jed's reflection in the window, steady, patient. She slid her hand over the ring on her finger, not a promise spoken, but a promise held. The story wasn't over, just beginning. She said it not as a plea, but as her truth. I chose to stay. The porch creaked under the weight of time and memory. It was late spring again. The cottonwoods stood taller, their branches whispering in the breeze. The fields had grown quiet, but not empty. Time had not forgotten this place. It had simply grown gentle with it. Clara sat on a wooden chair, her back straight despite the years. A shawl, frayed at the edges, draped across her shoulders. It was the same one she had once sewn from pieces of Jed's old shirt, stitched in silence, worn with care. Beside her, a young girl, no more than 10, sat cross-legged on the porch floor, a sketchbook in her lap, a pencil tucked behind her ear, curiosity in every movement. "Grandma," the girl asked, "how did you and Grandpa meet again?" Clara smiled, not just from her lips, but from the part of the heart that remembers not just moments, but the feeling inside them. "Well," Clara said, her voice warm, worn soft by time. "He came to town looking for a horse." She paused. The girl's pencil stilled. "And I was being sold like one." The girl blinked. "You were what?" Clara laughed gently, reached out and tucked a lock of hair behind the girl's ear. "It was a long time ago, darling. A very different world. But that day, I saw something in him. Something steady. Something kind. And I whispered, 'Take me. I can cook. I can bear you children, too.'" The girl frowned. "Did you mean it?" Clara's eyes glistened, light caught in memory. "No, not fully. Not then. I was scared. I just needed someone who wouldn't hurt me." She looked out across the pasture. And he didn't. The screen door creaked open. Jed stepped out slowly, cane in one hand, a mug of coffee in the other. He nodded toward the girl. She twisting the truth on you, yet he asked, eyes teasing. The girl giggled. Clara rolled her eyes. "I'm just telling the version where you didn't look like a lost ghost on horseback." Jed smirked. Fair enough. He eased himself into the chair beside her, shoulders brushing. They didn't need to hold hands. The distance between them was already gone. The girl leaned forward, eyes wide. "But you stayed, Grandma." Why, Clara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a child's question. It was a woman's question wrapped in innocence. Clara closed her eyes and then said softly, "Because I learned something. He didn't save me." The girl tilted her head. Clara looked at her husband, his face weathered, but calm. "He made space so I could save myself." The air held still for a moment, not silent, just still. Jed didn't speak. He never interrupted when Clara reached into truth. She turned back to the girl. "Some people will give you answers," she said. "He gave me room to ask better questions." The girl blinked slowly. "And love," she whispered. Clara nodded. Love came later. Inside the cabin, the smell of stew simmered faintly from the stove. Faint echoes of the life they had built in that house, no longer a refuge, but a home. They had grown old together, but not all at once. The girl turned the page of her sketchbook. She'd drawn 2 trees, one tall, one smaller, their roots tangled under the soil. Clara leaned in. "That's us," the girl said. Clara's throat tightened. "Yes, baby, that's us." Later that night, as stars blinked into place above the prairie, Clara and Jed sat alone again. No visitors, no children, just them. The fire crackled in the hearth. The light danced across the wooden walls that had once held silence, then fear, then warmth, and now peace. Clara looked over at Jed. "Do you remember the scarf?" she asked. He nodded. "I still have it," she said. She rose, walked to the drawer near the window, and pulled it out, still intact, still warm, still stitched with memory. She placed it on his lap. Jed ran his fingers along the seam. He traced the stitches slowly, one by one. Then, quietly, he looked up. "I never deserved you," he said. Clara knelt before him, eyes steady. "No one earns love, Jed. We only choose it." She placed a hand on his chest. "And I chose you. Every day, even the hard ones. Outside, the cottonwood leaves rustled like a lullaby, and for the first time in years, Jed let himself cry. Not because of pain, but because he'd been seen, truly seen, by the one person who mattered. That night, the wind changed. Not harsh, just new. Clara woke early, made coffee, and stood by the window. The sun cracked open the sky like a peach. Her body ached a little more these days, but her heart was still steady. She watched Jed stir in his chair, still asleep, and she whispered not to him, but to the morning I wasn't saved. I was allowed. She smiled, not out of happiness, but because she remembered the girl she'd once been, and the woman she had become. Later, the young girl from the porch returned. She held out a new drawing. This time, it was of the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, 2 chairs on the porch, one scarf hanging gently in the wind. Clara took it, held it to her heart. She didn't cry, just felt. As night fell, the prairie darkened gently. No storms, no shadows, just stars, clear and kind. And in that soft dark, Clara whispered one last thing, almost to herself. Love wasn't what saved me. She closed her eyes. It was what I chose when I finally believed I was worth saving. In a world that often rushes past quiet souls, this story reminds us of the healing power of being seen not for what we can offer, but for who we truly are. Clara wasn't rescued with grand gestures. She was given space. And sometimes, that's all it takes for someone to find their own strength again. Jed didn't need to be a hero. He simply chose to listen when others turned away. In that listening, love found a quiet place to grow, not in fireworks, but in firewood stacked by the door, in a scarf sewn from old memories, in a shared bowl of soup. This story isn't just about the Wild West. It's about choosing kindness when life has hardened us, about the courage to reach for connection even when it's easier to walk away. And most of all, it's about how love, real love, isn't taken or given. It's chosen, day after day. So if you're carrying scars or feeling forgotten, let this be your reminder. Healing doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes in silence, in patience, in the quiet presence of someone who stays. And in the end, that kind of love is the rarest kind of all. Thank you for spending your time with us and letting this story find a place in your heart. If it moved you, even just a little, please give it a like. Share it with someone you care about. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Echoes for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support keeps these echoes alive.